one and all, and listen to tales of excitement and adventure. Tales of daring heroes, savage monsters, and bards who just couldn't keep it in their pants. Tales of friendship, nobility, drunken foolishness, and unforgettable fun. These are tales of role-playing games, fair listeners, and this is Rollin' Bones. My name is Ryan Howard, and I shall be your guide.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Danishes and Dragons, your RPG morning show. I didn't stumble over the intro this time, which I'm very happy about. My name is Ryan Howard. I am your host and King of the Boneheads, and today we are going to be talking about weapons and armor in 5e and why I feel like those are particular weaknesses of 5e. Especially from a flavor standpoint. We'll get to that in just a little bit. Couple things I want to talk about first. Obviously, this is Danishes and Dragons. We're going to have a little bit of breakfast talk here. But before that, I've got a couple things I want to plug real quick. Because I just, on Friday, Tim Mathias from Knights and Nerds put out one of the first episodes of the new campaign for Knights and Nerds. And it is a behind-the-screen episode where Tim and I are discussing, building your own setting, building your own world for D&D, and how to populate it. What kinds of things to consider with that. So if you want to hear me talk about planning a campaign and planning a campaign setting in particular, it's Knights and Nerds podcast. You guys should already be listening to them because they're fantastic. I'm looking forward to the new campaign, and I'm sure that I'll do a couple of episodes with Tim, just kind of focused on what's going on in that particular world. So I'm excited for more Knights and Nerds. It's been a while, and just always more Knights and Nerds is good. On top of that, the other thing I want to talk about, we've got a couple friends of the show. We've got some campaigns going on actively right now. I haven't mentioned it on the show, at least not to any kind of significant degree, but Levi Combs currently has an ongoing zine Kickstarter, which I believe is called Magic and Shit. Let me look that up. It's got a name like that, but I want to drop a mention here for him real quick. Just pulling up Kickstarter. Planet X Games. Go to the Howling Crater page. Almost there. Yeah, Magic and Shit. It is a zine right now for Zine Quest, which is still going on. Let me make sure that it's not... It's got 9 days to go, so you guys can still back it right now. This one's very focused on like heavy metal type stuff and bringing that into a 5th edition setting, which is interesting. I do like some metal myself. I'm not as big of a metalhead as Levi is. I always hesitate to say that I like metal because inevitably someone's going to be like, oh, well, do you like this band that I love? And if I don't like them or haven't heard of them, then what's going to come back is, well, you're not really into metal. Metal's one of those things. It's like Warhammer. Or comics. Or Dungeons and Dragons, really. But no, I do like metal. I like symphonic metal. I like old school metal. I've been trying to get into Avenged Sevenfold. I know I just kicked over a hornet's nest there. But I really do think those guys are legit. And I know I'm like several years late to the party on that, but still. Anyway, that's Levi's Kickstarter. Next, I want to mention Saving Chult by Venger Satanis. This is kind of a stopgap that he's doing. It's going to be kind of similar to something that a zine quest would be. But this is kind of a set of short adventures that he's going to be putting out set within the world of Chult between Fuchsia Malaise and the third book. He's going to do a third Chult book at some point this year, but right now we're doing the Saving Chult Kickstarter. And basically, the number of adventures you get with this is dependent on how well the campaign does. But it's just some short modules that are set within that crazy world that he created. If you haven't read Chult or Fuchsia Malaise, you should definitely do so because it is nonsense world, and it's awesome. And then the last one I want to mention, and we're going to have him on at some point, hopefully, to talk about this, but John Hambone Maguire is putting out a Zine Quest game, 321 Action. And I believe the Zine Quest item that he's putting out is called Rocket to Russia. It all looks very interesting. I don't know if his campaign is live yet. It might be. I can always find that out, though, because, I've already got my phone pulled up here. So if I look up Rocket to Russia, maybe it's under 321 Action. Yeah, so it doesn't look like the campaign's live just yet, but that is coming at some point. And hopefully, Hambone's schedule will work out so he can come on the show and talk about it. I love talking to the guy. So, hearing a little bit about what he's working on with this project, this first game that he's working on, that would be awesome. Now, as we are kicking things off here, of course, this is Danishes and Dragons, so we're going to talk about some breakfast, because I love breakfast. I'm still on the same plan right now, still basically eating the same thing day in and day out. I have gotten the chance to add a little variety into my diet. Right now, I'm looking at, I can add white fish into pretty much every day as a substitute for chicken or turkey if I feel so inclined. And so I've done that a couple days this week, and that's been a nice change. I like fish. I honestly do like fish. And people who complain about fish being fishy, that's one of my, that is my irritant button. People are like, the fish is so fishy. I'm like, it's fish, you monkey. Just eat the fish. Or if you don't like it, don't eat the fish. Just don't complain about fish being fishy. It's like if I look at you and go, you're just too person-y. And I know that there's a lot of people who have trouble with, smell versus taste. Because, your olfactory nerves are tied into your taste buds and stuff like that. So if you can't smell, a lot of times you can't taste, or something smells bad. A lot of times it'll taste bad. Texture's another issue that Elfie is bringing up in chat here. And I definitely understand texture issues sometimes. My dad is the king of just saying, I don't like the texture, and I won't understand what he's talking about. I kind of get it with bananas. My dad hates bananas. He says it's a texture issue, and yeah, I understand that. Dad doesn't like anything slimy. Not a big avocado guy. Doesn't really like eggs either. I don't think eggs are slimy, though. If your eggs are slimy, you're not cooking them long enough. I guess like a sunny side up egg would be a little bit if you cooked it over easy, it might be a little slimy, especially the yolk, because that's the point of a sunny side up egg. But I don't do that because it's messy. I usually scramble my eggs so I can kind of mix the turkey bacon in with them, and yeah, that ends up being pretty good actually. Yeah, I'm a scrambled eggs guy. If that makes you upset for any reason, I don't know what to tell you. But yeah, that's pretty much the world I'm living in. The diet's starting to slowly but surely open up. Progress has been great. I'm already down 10 pounds. I don't know if you can see that or not, but I'm already down 10 pounds. My hope is that by March, I'll be back to where I was last March. That's kind of the goal here, basically just to undo a year's worth of damage in 3 months. See if we can do it. I think we can. This diet's been pretty good. But then from there, I'll have to, kind of pick up, and make the progress that I was hoping to make this past year, just this year. And I'll be going to a new gym because, we're moving. This is going to be the last broadcast from this location. The wall behind me is going to change here, not next week, but the week after. You guys will see it. And yeah, I'm excited for that. I'm going to have a new studio. It's going to be awesome. Excuse me. So, that's really all the breakfast talk. Not a lot to discuss there still. But, yeah, let's dig in here to talking about weapons and armor in 5th edition. So let's migrate on over to screen share. Alrighty. Welcome to my discussion of 5th edition weapons and armor. I'm going to move some things around here. This might be a little bit of kind of showing my hand, but we're going to start off pretty simple, just kind of going over what is available to you in 5th edition. So we're on D&D Beyond right here, basic rules. And we are going to take a look at the types of weapons and armor that you can get in 5th edition. So, starting off, we're not going to go over armor proficiency. That's, y'all should know that. And if you don't, then, there's intro to 5th edition videos out there. This isn't an intro to 5th edition. This is me just kind of bitching about what you can and cannot equip on your character in 5th edition. So, starting off with light armor, you're looking at padded armor, which is 11 plus your dex modifier with a disadvantage on stealth. That already does not make a damn bit of sense. We'll get to that. I'll circle back around here. Then you've got leather, which is the same kind of modifier there, but with no disadvantage. And then you've got studded leather. Studded leather is the first problem point that we have here. It's 12 plus your dex modifier. Studded leather is not real. There's no such thing. It never really existed. And the idea of putting studs on armor, making it more protective, is stupid. If anything, if there were studded leather armor out there, they'd be on there for protection, not for protection, for decoration. Just kind of to look cool. But yeah, studded leather armor, not actually real. And we'll come around to kind of where that came from and, all that in just a little bit. So just to kind of break this down by, category, padded armor, what would be called padded armor here would be, in real life, a gambeson, which I did not pull up. Let me go ahead and do this. By the way, I am borrowing prolifically here from Shadiversity. When it comes to discussions of medieval armor and weapons and medieval history in an entertaining and fun way. Shadiversity is one of my favorite YouTube channels. And he's done this whole series called Fantasy Rearmed, which is basically about bringing slightly more realism into fantasy based on, medieval, late medieval, and Renaissance armors that were available to people. So, what we are looking at here is Gambesson. Let me go ahead and pull up some images here. You guys have seen these before. That's what a Gambesson looks like. Here's a Gambesson with some pauldrons. Let's see. A couple more examples here. If we go to Witcher 3, in Witcher 3, that's what the Gambesson looks like. The Gambesson is super ugly in Witcher 3. And some things are incorrectly labeled as Gambessons in there, but that's a whole nother kettle of fish. But if you want to look at like what a cool-looking Gambesson looks like in The Witcher, the Ursine armor. Let me see if we can get a big picture here of the Ursine armor. Let's go back. Can't go back. What does that look like for you guys? Okay, yeah. That's a big enough picture over here. Let's see if we can find a kind of better picture. But the cloth part here on this armor, this is a cleaner picture here. The cloth part on the armor is a Gambesson. Now you'll see some studs there. That's for decoration, I imagine. Those aren't for protection because that's a piece of cloth. Basically, Gambesson is padded armor. It's a padded under armor layer that's designed to give you extra protection from slashing and piercing weapons. Typically it's worn under plate armor or under mail, but sometimes for certain people it would be worn just as armor. Like if you were, here's a good example. If I pull up this picture here, this guy. This would be like basically your medieval foot soldier. Probably a farmer, probably not very wealthy, but he would be required to maintain some kind of armament for, use in war when the king would call on his soldiers. So, what can, a farmer afford? A Gambesson, maybe a little bit of mail. You can see some mail greaves down there. Usually a sword and a polearm, because foot soldiers would mostly be using polearms in a combat situation. And then some kind of helmet. And has a dagger as well. So this is kind of like your entry-level armor, the armor that everyone could afford. What kind of grinds my gears about the classification of it is one, the disadvantage on stealth. That's nonsense. That Gambesson does not restrict your movement all that much. It's like wearing a coat, really. Maybe a heavy coat, but it's not going to restrict it's not going to restrict your movement at all. It's not going to make any noise. It's not going to make you any less dexterous. So disadvantage on stealth is nonsense. And in fact, in my game, if you're wearing padded armor, you should, you won't be getting disadvantage on stealth. Next up, leather. Again, leather armor, I don't want to say it didn't exist, because that is a can of worms in history discussion. Shadiversity's done several videos on this. Other people have done videos on this as well. Leather armor is not a common thing in kind of medieval history. It's also not super protective, not as much as you would think it would be. And part of the reason behind this, leather is expensive, and the average person who is wearing armor would not be able to afford leather. And yes, it's more expensive than even like just regular cloth that a gambeson would be made from. Because there's been discussion about what the cost of linen was versus what the cost of leather was. And all of that. This is a whole conversation that I'm just kind of dipping my toe into right now. But from my understanding of history, leather armor is kind of nonsense. And so to kind of, make light armor a little bit more realistic, you should probably get rid of leather and studded leather altogether. And probably move breastplate. Actually, no. Breastplate's good where it is. Move hide and chain shirt up to light armor. Because that's really, what you're dealing with there. So, that's light armor. And while we're here, shields. The shield in 5th edition is just a blanket +2 modifier to your armor class. There's no distinction between different kinds of shields. Shields only do one thing unless you have the shield master feat that lets you bash people to knock them over. Shields are very vanilla in 5e. We'll come around to shields, though. I want to finish the armor conversation first. So next up, as I discussed, hide armor. That's got some historical significance to it. That and chain shirt belong up in the light armor category. I think it's funny that chain shirt has no detriment to your stealth, but padded armor does. A chain shirt would jingle around. It's also heavier. So I don't know what is going on there, but yeah, that's nonsense. Now, next up you have scale mail. Scale mail is a real thing. Let's pull up some examples here. Some historical examples. Because they're fantasy examples. But yeah, when you're talking about scale mail, what you're looking at is generally, historical versions of scale mail. Generally, you're looking at something like this. And that's a bad picture. That's better. But yeah, it's pieces of, scale armor woven together that would kind of allow you to, deflect things. It's not as effective as you might think it is. It's not super widely used, but it's a real thing that certain cultures used at certain points. And kind of related to scale mail, and this is where people might get mad at me for saying that leather armor is not really a thing. But when you're talking about lamellar armor from samurais, it's a little bit closer related to scale mail and a little bit closer related to something else, which I'll talk about here in just a little bit. But lamellar is not necessarily leather armor. There's leather on the outside, but there's more to it than that. This doesn't put a bullet in the leather armor isn't real argument, or leather armor wasn't prominent argument. And that's also not taking into account, buff coats. But buff coats are a Renaissance thing, mostly dealing with, dueling and stuff like that. So, if you were dueling with rapiers, you're wearing a buff coat, which would help kind of protect you from thrusts and stuff like that. So, that scale mail, it's fine. It's rated pretty much where it should be. Same with a breastplate. And then half plate. And half plate is one of those weird things that's kind of hard to define. Now, there is... it's kind of a weird historical precedent here. But before there was like full plate armor, before people figured out how to make like full suits of armor, half plate would be kind of the most armor that you got. And it would mostly be, you know, like a chain shirt with a gambeson underneath, a breastplate, some kind of helmet, and some kind of greaves, and some kind of arm protection. So, like, if we look up half-plate armor here. Yes, Google. Half-plate armor. You'd be looking at something like this. Here's a better picture of this. You know, you'd have a cuirass, you'd have pauldrons, some kind of arm protection, and then greaves around your shins. That's pretty much half plate. Like the Mandalorian's wearing half plate. Sometimes they treat him like he's wearing full plate, but no, that's mostly what you're dealing with there. And usually some kind of helmet. Because helmets, that's another thing that fantasy is kind of weird about sometimes, and you know, people just generally don't mention or don't acknowledge in 5th edition, unless they're playing like a knight or a paladin of some sort. Most people don't mention helmets, but helmets are super important to medieval combat, because you got to protect your head. There's a reason why helmets exist in some form or another in most forms of warfare, with the exception of like 16th, 17th, 18th century European warfare. Actually, 16th century they did still have helmets, but you know, once you're in like the 17th and 18th centuries, helmets start going away as warfare becomes more quote-unquote civilized. And that carries over like through the 19th and into the early 20th century, where you know, warfare devolves again, and you've got trench warfare, and people discover, hey, we need helmets again. So yeah, helmets are important. But yeah, half plate is definitely a thing. Now, here's where I have to mention a different kind of armor that's also just generally been omitted. That would fall, I guess, under the half-plate category, but I feel like deserves its own entry here. That's brigandine armor. Now, again, you'll see some of this is leather, and it has studs on it. Let me explain. Brigandine is a cloth or leather exterior. Let's see. Yeah, this is a good shot of it here. It's a cloth or leather exterior with plates of metal riveted on the inside. And so those studs that you see there are rivets holding metal plates in. And what this gives you is a flexible but protective layer of armor. So you're not as encumbered as you would be with a breastplate on, or with a with like full plate on, but you have a degree more of protection than you would get from just having a gambeson or just chainmail, because there's no gaps in it. So basically, and you can see, not so much on this, but if I pull up this historical drawing here, you can see that there's a structure to this thing. It's not a it's not like a piece of flexible leather. You've got plates that, you know, go down to the thin waist, which was a that was an aesthetic choice in the medieval period. A lot of armor that you'll see actually does have some kind of aesthetic design value to it. But that's a conversation for another time. And then you'll see there's more plates at the bottom, so it tapers in and then it flares back out at the bottom. Those are more metal plates. this is here's a really good picture of it. That is a extremely structured piece of armor. It's not a piece of leather with studs on it. It's a piece of leather over top of a metal breastplate, essentially. And so this is where I think the idea of studded leather comes from. Those studs, now this is not real brigandine. You can see the inside. There's not pieces of metal there. This is a costume piece. But those studs are not there for protection. Those are there to kind of rivet the metal to the leather. So this is where the idea of studded leather comes from, but it's not. Studded leather as we know it is not a real thing. And no, you can't just say that studded leather is brigandine, because brigandine's a lot more protective than what studded leather would lead you to believe. So this kind of needs to be addressed, in my opinion. Here's an example of brigandine where the metal plates are on the outside, which was a thing you could do as well. And here's Shadiversity and his brigandine, which you can see, I mean, a lot of times, like you see this guy here, he's got metal pauldrons over top of his brigandine, whereas Shad has brigandine pauldrons, along with the brigandine arm guards. I think he has greaves as well. But yeah. That's brigandine. It's completely overlooked. You can pair it with chainmail. You can pair it with a gambeson for added protection. And that's another thing that I feel like 5e drops the ball on armor. And this is a very crunchy idea. So I understand that 5e is, not looking to add a bunch of crunch. But armor is worn in layers. And it feels like the more layers you wear, the more protected you almost should be. If you're wearing half plate, or if you're wearing, chainmail, like if we go down here, chainmail, ringmail, you're still wearing a gambeson. You're still wearing padded armor. Because that's your underlayer. So you're not, ditching a certain kind of armor for another kind in many circumstances. You still have a chain shirt on underneath your breastplate or your half plate if you're smart. And so it feels like there should be this kind of concept of layered armor. And, okay, you start off with just a gambeson, but then you can add a chain shirt to it, and, that ups your AC a little bit. So, maybe you start with a base AC of 11 or 12 plus your dex modifier. Then you can add more to it. You add 2, add 3, add, whatever, as you're adding pieces to your armor. That's a little bit more representative of what armor would actually be like in kind of medieval battlefields. Is it kind of crunchy and silly? Yes, but also I feel like it paints a better picture than what, these kind of loose classifications of armor, some of which are entirely inaccurate, paint in 5th edition. So, let's finish off here with heavy armor. There's not as many issues here with heavy armor. The only thing I would add is that banded mail should be a thing here. Maybe lamellar is all... Actually, lamellar would be along the same lines as brigandine. Because it had plates and structure to it as well. So, ringmail is kind of a silly thing. Let's take a look here. Ringmail. Or ring armor. It's a weird classification. It's kind of like big loops of chain. It's not proper chainmail, though. This is rendering of it. This is kind of it here from Vikings, although Vikings is not great on historical accuracy, to be perfectly honest. I guess this is supposed to represent like chainmail over top of something like gambeson. Ring armor is real, I believe. Like if we look this up here, it's basically like a sheet of leather with kind of bigger loops on it. And it's actually, I mean, if we look at the Wikipedia page here, we don't have any historical examples of this. It's it might actually be a mistake of historians, because it's kind of based on interpretations of medieval tapestries, which are probably just people wearing chainmail. So ringmail might not actually be real. That is a problem. I will amend my position on that. Then you have chainmail here. This is like a full set of chainmail, so that's what makes it different from chain shirt. This is a shirt, a hauberk, which is the hood thing, leg armor, some kind of greave, and some kind of arm protection, and maybe even some kind of neck protection. Then you have splint. Splint armor is also a little bit odd. Its existence is more along the lines of splint, like breastplates, don't seem to be a real thing. I guess, like, this guy kind of made some. This is maybe kind of more accurate a position for brigandine, would be the splint armor position. Because splint armor in real life was basically limited to arm and leg protection. Because it would give you long bands that things could deflect off of. And it's typically worn along with a regular breastplate or along with chainmail. This is a woman wearing splint armor, I suppose. But as far as breastplates of splint go, and like chest armor, cuirasses made from splint, it seems more accurate that this would be brigandine. So maybe I would replace splint armor with brigandine and just leave half plate alone. That might be an option there. Seems a little bit better to me. So yeah. That's what we're looking at. And then plate armor is plate armor. It's super protective, it's super flexible. It's not as heavy as you might think it is, but that's neither here nor there. So, that's armor. Moving on from there, we get to shields. And here's my problem with shields just being a blanket +2 to your AC. If we go over here, there are several different kinds of shields that offer several different levels of protection. So, I mean, if we're looking at types of shields, you've got the Aspis, the Hoplite shield, the big round, like, Spartan shield. The Targe is maybe a smaller example of that, kind of the Viking shield. Then you've got, like if we look at some of these, you've got these Nguni shields or Guni shields that they carried in Africa, the hide shields that are a little bit bigger. But the biggest ones that I want to talk about as kind of problems for the D&D conception of what a shield is would be the... Let's see if I can find it here. be looking at the kite shield if we go to this page, and then I guess the tower shield, the buckler is another example here if I open that one. Let's go to the shield wall, because this will give me a good example of what we're talking about here. So the buckler, let's start here. A buckler is a tiny shield. It's like, I don't know, this big maybe. And it's for dueling. Or for, like, carrying in, basically in personal duels. Like, you see it here. It's not a combat weapon. It is a combat weapon, but it's not a war weapon. It is a dueling weapon. So you'd carry it in personal combat. But this would not give you a full +2. This would probably give you like a +1. This couldn't stop arrows necessarily, because it's tiny. It's more for kind of dexterous fighting. You know, if you, I should be doing it in this hand because this is your offhand, this is your sword hand. But this would be like if you had a one-handed sword in this hand, you'd have a buckler in this hand, and you'd be able to, you know, deflect enemy blows and kind of set yourself up for, you know, better strikes. Another example of something that did this in a similar fashion is the parrying dagger. We'll get to that in just a second, though. But yeah, this would offer at most +1. And it's used with a falchion or a rapier, you know, so either a one-edged sword or a stabbing sword. And it has no representation at all in D&D. Then you have the kite shield and the shield wall. These are much larger shields. These are shields that are meant to protect you from, like, neck to shins. And the round shields that the Greeks would carry would offer something similar. And the shield wall here I mentioned because, you know, if you think about like a tower shield that, you know, people would carry sometimes that you could stick in the ground and hide behind, these don't really have any representation because these would be a lot heavier but offer a lot more protection. A kite shield or a shield wall. This isn't a heater shield. It's not a buckler. It's not a round shield. These would, at the very least, offer +3. And shield wall, tower shield should offer, you know, the opportunity to stick the shield in the ground and have some kind of cover. Now, I have friends who have, like, homebrewed stuff like this. But I think the shield needs a little bit more variation in the player's handbook as a piece of equipment. You need to have multiple different kinds of shields to show just how versatile a shield could be. And, you know, this is a little bit off topic, but, like, if we look at... there are weapons that are basically like a buckler with a dagger attached to it. Mostly those were used in, like, gladiatorial combat. But they were weapons. And something like that, I think, you know, you should be able to have a buckler with a thing on it, you know, that counts as a shield, but also offers you an offhand weapon. Just like, you know, it's a dagger attack. And this is kind of a transition into actual weapons. Talking about the parrying dagger. So let's, I closed that D&D Beyond. Let's see. M5E. So we got onto weapons. You've got, you know, your daggers and your simple weapons and your martial weapons, martial ranged weapons, and then there are some special weapons as well. But if you look at something, let's take, for example, the dagger here. It's a D4 piercing weapon. That's fine. However, 5e does not properly account for what a dagger was used for in combat. This is where the parrying dagger comes in. Now, this is more of a Renaissance era thing. If we're talking about, the main gouge and the sword breaker, that's more where this comes in. But a lot of times, if you were using a messer, if you were using a rapier, some kind of one-handed dueling weapon, in the other hand, you could have a buckler, but you could also have a dagger. And this dagger would mostly be for parrying. And, catching the opponent's weapon. As you can see here. In this tiny picture over here, let's enlarge that. This guy is parrying that rapier blow with his dagger. And these daggers had cross guards on them so that you could do this without hurting yourself. Here is an example of a historical main gouge. It has this hand protection over it, this clamshell handguard, so that you're not getting hit in the hand with a sword. And this one in particular has little slots specifically for catching a sword and moving it aside. Now, another example of this would be the sword breaker. This is just a drawing of it. So this is a dagger that comes to a point. If you are familiar with the Wheel of Time series, you should already know about this, because one of the characters carried a sword breaker. But the idea of this is that these serrations are there so you can catch a sword. And theoretically, you can twist it around and then take your sword, or, use the leverage that this thing gives you, and break the opponent's sword. They did this on Forged in Fire, and I think it worked. I think that was the challenge. You had to make a sword breaker that could break a sword. But in general, it would be something very hard to pull off. But still, this kind of thing is, perfect for fantasy. It's perfect for, you parry and you basically have your opponent grappled because you're using this parrying dagger. And so you should be able to have the option of, I use a reaction to parry with this dagger. It adds a little bit to your AC. Kind of like the defensive duelist feat. However, I think defensive duelist is meant to kind of simulate this. It doesn't do it very well, though, because you don't have the option to grapple. And something like this, whether it should be its own separate feat, like main gouge as a feat, that allows you to use a dagger to parry, and on a reaction, you make a grapple check, and if you succeed, then you grapple the opponent. And they have disadvantage to melee attacks because you have their hand. People would do this with cloaks as well. Use them to catch swords. But yeah, this is a true historical weapon that's completely absent, and it's cool, and it makes a lot of sense in a fantasy setting, and it lets you do cool things, but it's completely absent from 5e. And I know it's absent probably largely because of how it complicates things, but still, it should be in there. It should definitely be in there. Now, moving on from there, a lot of this stuff I don't want to spend too much time on. The spear in 5e is absolutely disgraceful. It should be a D8 all day. It should be, well, I guess if you use it two-handed, it's a D8. But if you use it with a shield, like a Spartan, then you max out at a D6. I think it should have the same damage properties as a longsword, where it's versatile and it's a D10 if you use it two-handed, but it's a D8 by itself. So, that's all I have to say on the spear, because it's a simple weapon. We'll get more into like halberds and stuff like that down here. Anyway. Let's start with the short sword and the long sword and the rapier. And the scimitar, while we're on it. First of all, D6 piercing for a short sword. Short swords should be dealing slashing damage. I know you need a D6 piercing weapon, so that's why it does that, but that's not, like, short swords are not piercing weapons, they're slashing weapons. That's always bothered me. If you want a piercing D6 weapon to like be a stopgap between the dagger and the rapier, although why you would need one, who knows? You know, just have like a larger knife, a stiletto. Stiletto could be the stopgap there. It's D6 piercing. It's more designed for piercing. It's triangular blade. So, anyway. That bothers me, but then we get to the scimitar. And this is where some of the problems with how weapons are designed in 5e come in. Because I think Mike Merle said for every property you add to a weapon, you drop down its damage die. So you start at a d12. And then you go down from there based on, is it a finesse weapon? Is it a light weapon? Is it thrown? That kind of stuff. That doesn't really make sense to me. At all. Like, at all. I guess maybe you start at a D8, and then every good thing that you give it, you add, or every restriction you put on it, like it's heavy, it's reach, it's two-handed, you add a dice. Basically, that classification doesn't make any damn sense. Not to me, anyway. And part of the problem here is the rapier is a D8 piercing weapon. It's a finesse weapon that does a D8 damage. It's kind of your top level if you're using finesse weapons. There should be a D8 slashing weapon that's not the longsword. There should be a D8 finesse slashing weapon. And that's where we get into the falchion, which along with it comes the messer, the backsword. We'll talk about the scimitar in relation to this. But the backsword, these are your classifications of the saber, the falchion, the messer, and the basket-hilted sword. The Scottish backsword is, another name for it. The cutlass is in here as well. And basically a backsword is a sword. It's only got one edge on it. It has a thick back to it that tapers down into a slashing blade. So these aren't really thrusting weapons. These are slashing weapons. Your cavalry saber is a good example of this. But these weapons should be should be considered a D8 slashing weapon. There should be a category of, whether you want to call them messers or falchions or, whatever you want to call them. They don't have to be light. Although I do think, I guess if you want a light finesse weapon, scimitar. Again, though, scimitar is a weird classification, and scimitars are also not light. They're one-handed. But I feel like it would be better if the scimitar category was replaced with backswords. And then, within that there's range for, this is what a messer does, this is what a, it could be a messer, a scimitar, a shamshir, a killage, all the different classifications of backswords in there. And then you have a D8 slashing finesse weapon that could maybe cover that could cover the messers and stuff like that. Kind of the bigger, longer weapons. Something similar to a rapier, because for some characters, and I know Elfie is an example of this, for some characters, it just doesn't feel right to carry a rapier. It doesn't fit your character. It doesn't fit what you're trying to do. It doesn't make sense with your fighting style. If you're a 2-weapon ranger, you're going to want to do like dervish-style slashing damage. That's, you're going to be doing slashing damage. You want to be like Dritzt, swinging your scimitars around. It doesn't make sense for you to fight with 2 rapiers at that point. I played a ranger who fought with 2 rapiers. I did that for like 1 session with Cromwell. It was weird. Because I was like, what do? I stab, and then I stab again, and you're stabbing all the time. I know that, like, piercing is generally more efficient and more damaging than slashing, but still, it's a matter of what you feel your character would do or what your character would do given a certain situation. With characters who, are fighting two-handed, now I know using 2 rapiers is historically supported, just like using a rapier and a parrying dagger is, but not in-game supported. Using 2 slashing weapons, you should be able to get up to that D8 level just because, you want to keep with slashing weapons. You should absolutely be free to have, if you have the 2-weapon fighting style, that lets you wield heavy weapons, or lets you wield any weapon two-handed, including longswords, theoretically, if you invest your strength in that, you should have a D8 option for slashing weapons. That lets you use your dexterity instead of your strength. Because just going by classification here, that should be an option. It absolutely should be an option. And I don't know why it isn't. I think it's dumb. I think the whole concept of scimitars needs to be reworked and, like, split into 2 categories, basically. Now, from there, we need to talk a little bit about halberds and polearms in general. Because halberds are, heavy, 2-handed weapons. They deal 1d10 slashing. But, again, in reality, what you're dealing with a halberd, let's show this example of the Scots. Halberds are multifaceted weapons. A lot of cases, you have a spike at the end, as you can see here, if we zoom in. You've got the spike here at the end. You have a spike at the back, and you have an axe blade. And what this is for is to be used against troops on horseback. You would, or, troops in armor. You would use the cutting blade to knock them off their horse, or to trip them, and then you would use the point to either try to break into their armor if the armor was weak enough that you could, spike through it, or you would use the big spike to, like, find a gap in their armor. You could use it to cut, like, you could use the blade to cut if you were up against lightly armored opponents, like, these Scots here aren't wearing armor. Not that I can see, at least. And these are, like, Renaissance Scots. Because this is a late medieval weapon, so that's why they're not really armored. That and they're Scottish. Although the ancient Scots did use some kind of armor. But yeah, the halberd offers you multiple different damage varieties, but that is not at all reflected in any of the polearms here. Not a pike. Like a pike basically just does piercing damage. A halberd just does slashing. Glaives obviously just do slashing. But even then, a lot of glaives... Like, we look up a glaive here. You'll find historical examples of glaives that have spikes at the end. I'm having trouble finding examples here. But there are real weapons that, they're glaives with a spike at the end, with a spear point at the end. So all of these polearms should offer some kind of versatility in the types of damage they deal, which is important for certain monsters that you go up against. If you're fighting skeletons, they're vulnerable to bludgeoning damage because they're skeletons. Some things might resist slashing damage or might resist bludgeoning damage, but be vulnerable to the others. Sometimes piercing might be... Like, if you're up against a Rakshasa. Rakshasas are vulnerable to piercing damage from good-aligned characters. So, if you are a lawful good paladin, and you are fighting with a halberd, you should be able to fight that Rakshasa with the spear point and do piercing damage. So... the way that I would change up all of these polearms is, I would allow for, let's say they do primarily on the halberd a D10 slashing. But they also can do a D8 piercing. Although I think I would allow for a full D10 piercing, honestly. Because again, if we look at a pike, some of them are just piercing, but I mean, like, if you look at that, that's got a cutting blade on it, as well as a point. Same here, although that would be like a hook. But a pike like that, it's got this is a decorative pike, but it has an axe blade and a point. And a spike back here. None of these weapons just do one thing. That's why they were invented. These weapons were meant to be more versatile than just dealing one damage type. So, with a polearm, you ought to be able to slash and stab. And I don't know what you would call that. Damage variance, maybe. Versatility is already taken based on, what's offered in the game. Because versatile in 5e means you can use it one-handed or two. But you should have a variety of damage types when it comes to these weapons. And it does take some specialization in-game to get these weapons. To be effective with them, well, first of all, you need to be a fighter or a paladin or possibly a barbarian. Although barbarians usually benefit from going sword and board or axe and board. sometimes great weapon fighting, but again, there's also feed investment that you should take into account because, if you're doing something like this, you've got Polearm Master, which does allow you a second attack with the back end of the polearm, but it does bludgeoning damage. It doesn't do piercing damage. So you should have the option, and I keep saying the same thing over and over again, but you should have the option within within these polearms to do slashing or piercing or bludgeoning damage in some cases, because sometimes instead of an axe head, they would have a hammerhead. Now, I know that's kind of covered by the Warhammer, but again, Warhammers had a pick at the end or a spike on them, so they should also, offer that kind of variance. Does it make things more complicated? Kinda, but I think it's important. I think it's important to be true to what these weapons were historically and what people understand these weapons to be. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is the longbow and the short bow, which is up here, I think. Where's my short bow? There we go. Simple ranged weapon. Short bow. Short bow is a D6 piercing weapon. Long bow is a D8 piercing weapon. There needs to be a third classification of bow. And maybe it should go short bow, recurve bow, long bow. But there needs to be a more damaging bow, because the crossbow should not be significantly more damaging than the longbow. That's dumb. A heavy crossbow should not do more damage than the heaviest longbow, because what we're looking at here is the English longbow, aka the war bow. And for people who don't know how long longbows could be, the average longbow was about 6'6". It was bigger than the user. And it had like hundreds of pounds of draw weight. And the guys who would use these things had just like the biggest backs ever. They were like monsters. Imagine how many pull-ups they could do. But they were like, you draw this bow back way, way, way far, and then you'd let loose an arrow, and it would just go and go and go, and you'd be shooting across a battlefield with this. That needs to be a classification in D&D. You need to have a heavy bow, a war bow, even if you just want to call it a long bow. But there should be a D6, a D8, and a D10 bow. The same way there's a D6, D8, and D10 crossbow. Because, historically, again, that's how bows were used. They had, like, if we go down here, draw weights of these bows could go up to like 150, 160 pounds. Maybe even as high as 185 pounds. These things were tremendous. And the arrows were like a half-inch in diameter. These were like big arrows and big bows that were shooting, and they could penetrate armor in some cases. But yeah, that's my whole thing on these weapons. That's really what I have to say about the way 5e handles weapons. It's very, very basic. And the last thing I want to talk about here, I've already talked about it a little bit, but the last thing I want to mention is the way it handles unarmed combat. Because I talked about this a couple videos ago, we talked about unarmed combat. 5e needs to give you weapons that help with unarmed combat. Brass knuckles, knuckle spikes, stuff like that. Those should be options for you. And, weapons with them should still count as unarmed strikes. You just deal extra damage with them, that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's not an option in 5e, and it should be. And 5e needs to accommodate players who, or maybe not 5e, the next revision of D&D, when they, when rules bloat sets in a couple years and they have to restart with a 6th edition or 5.5 edition. At that point, they need to accommodate people who want to play unarmed fighters, unarmed, like fisticuffs fighters, and people who want to take advantage of these, old school, crazy medieval weapons that existed and, the variants therein. That needs to be addressed moving forward. And maybe it can be addressed with feats. Maybe it can be addressed with the way that the weapons are described. But it needs to happen. It needs to be fixed. Because, ultimately, it seems like every fighter, every weapon you use, it all feels the same. I bash or poke with the weapon. There's no room for creativity with weapons and creativity with how you attack. And I don't know how to address that. I don't know if any systems do it better. If anyone knows of any, let me know. I don't know if Zweihander handles it better. I just don't know. I honestly, I'd be curious to figure it out and to find out. So if anyone knows, let me know. But at this point, I'm just kind of rambling. So let's go ahead and end this thing. If we go back to solo here for a second. Yeah. So those are my thoughts on weapons and armor in 5e. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope it wasn't too ranty for you. At some point, I'll be returning to this. I'm still, going back and forth of whether or not I should, try to publish something about this to, address things within 5e. I just don't know. So, anyway, that's going to be it for today's episode, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Next week, we'll be off, but we'll be back the week after. I'll keep you posted on what we're doing then. But, until then, whether you rolled a 1 or a 20, I'm so glad that you rolled your bones with me, Ryan Howard, and I'll see you next time.